Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Left, Wrong, and Center. I'm left of center.
I'm center left.
Yes, you are. Today, we have a great guest with us. Grant, would you like to introduce your professor?
Absolutely. So this is Dr. Lena Surzhko Harned.
Almost.
Almost.
Give it to me one more time.
Surzhko Harned.
Surzhko Harned.
And the reason why Grant has having difficulty pronouncing my name because none of my students actually call me by my last name, and they call me
Dr. Lena.
Awesome.
So Dr. Lena was a professor of mine at Penn State, and I wanted to bring her on the podcast to talk about the situation that's going on in Ukraine that's been going on for quite some time. As a student of Dr. Lena's, she actually is instrumental in me understanding this whole dynamic in the sense of bringing it to the forefront. She had a big impact in my life at making this one of my top issues. If you've listened to the podcast, you know it's my top 5 issues. It's in the top 5.
Yeah. He brings it up almost every time.
It's something that I'm very passionate about because I cannot believe that it's still occurring.
Yeah.
We wanted to bring Dr. Lena on the show to talk about the current state of the conflict, but also give a historical background to our listeners to make sure that they can understand what's going on currently, but also what's going on in the past, and make sure that this kind of gets brought back to the forefront because in my personal view, and I think in Dr. Lena's view, and in Kyle's view, this is getting pushed to the back burner, and it's a very real conflict where people are dying, people are being hurt, people are being displaced, and this is something that needs to end, but it needs to be a righteous end for the people of Ukraine. So with that, Dr. Lena, thank you so much for being with us.
And thank you. That was quite an introduction. Thanks for having me.
And I wanted to just jump right in. A lot of our listeners might not, we have listeners all across the country, not to give us a pat on the back, but very diverse viewpoints, very diverse locations of the United States. They might have not met someone who's from Ukraine originally. Not only are you from the country, but you're an expert on Ukraine and Eastern European politics.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about your upbringing. And I believe you mentioned when we were, I'm not trying to age you, but you were born in the USSR technically.
Guilty, yeah.
So tell us a little bit about being raised there, and then I would love to get some, then we'll move into kind of the more modern questions.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, you're right. I caught the last decade of USSR, and of course then I also caught the decade following the collapse of USSR and sort of the beginning of independent Ukraine when it regained its independence in 1991 when USSR collapsed. So the United States has been my home for over 20 years, and right, I find myself sort of in both shoes, right, as a American, but also as a person who is from Ukraine, who has family in Ukraine. Actually, like my sister's there, my aunts, my grandmother, my father's grave is there. So it is a very personal thing. Also, I grew up Russian speaking.
Okay.
So on that, I also have that layer of experience of not being only this product of a late decade of Soviet education system, but also of a lot of these colonial Soviet legacies that came with it, and of course the Russian and indoctrination into Russian culture and Russian language, and sort of how that also squared with this new reality, right, of independent Ukraine. So, yeah, that's basically the story of mine.
Gotcha. And would you want to dive in, because I wanted to make sure, again, I don't think the United States K through 12 system has taught, European history. I don't think it's part of the curriculum. It might be, but the country of Ukraine has been around forever, right? And this USSR took it over in that 1918, 1919 section. Is that correct?
So yes and no. There's actually a really tortured history, right, between what is now called the Russian Federation and what is now called Ukraine. And as I tell my students, it's kind of remarkable to me that in 21st century, a lot of the conflict still has to go to like Middle Ages. This big dispute over the legacy of the first really sort of recorded state that was placed in Kyiv, that was called Kyiv and Rus, Kyivska Rus, that was based in Kyiv, and then sort of we can trace it back to what, like first 700-800 years of AD, and of course from Kyiv came the spread of Orthodox and Christianity. So Kyiv's Prince Volodymyr was the one who brought Christianity to that part of the world, and by the early sort of 10th century, so 11th century, Kyiv was sort of this prominent European state. That was, state in those terms, not like in modern terms, but nonetheless, right? Kyiv princes participated in European politics. You may or may not know, but one of the Prince Volodymyr's granddaughters then was actually married off to Queen of France and became Queen Anne of France.
Oh, okay.
And that is one.
Did not know that.
Yeah, and it's a really cool story because this Kyiv princess, she brought her Bible to France, and on that Bible, French kings have sworn when they were crowned.
Oh wow.
Wow.
Okay.
Yeah. So there's that, and there's also a very interesting story about how then the French government, when the Soviet Union was being created, and Soviets did this absolutely horrific thing of destroying religion, destroying churches, and there's this beautiful cathedral in Kyiv called Sofia, and it's actually the oldest cathedral, Orthodox cathedral, that was actually built by Greeks. Right, when Kyiv was baptized, it still stands, and the Soviets wanted to blow it up, and the French government actually stepped in to save that particular relic, right? And they kind of said that this is not just part of the religious heritage, right, but also part of the cultural heritage that is also dating back then to French monarchy, right, because of this connection with Anne. So it's one instance, but there's also this other historical stuff about how Kyiv was really influential in early European history, on par with other places around Europe, like formation of Britain, formation of France, and so on and so on. And then Kyiv was sacked in 13th century by the Mongol invasion, and basically from that moment on, Kyiv does not recover. And the center of the statehood, and this is where lots of disputes happened historically, but it sort of gets moved north. And one of those places is Novgorod, which is now, of course, the Russian city, but then it was part of the greater Rus, and to Moscow. And Moscow, on the face of it, is, much, much younger city than Kyiv. But at some point of time, and actually, you can probably trace it, fast forward a little bit, a few hundred years to first the Ivan, who you know as the Terrible, and then to Peter, who you know as the Great, Peter I, who actually then claims the legacy of Rus. Mm-hmm. And this is when the first time we hear the word Russia really being sort of used in a political sense. So there is sort of this dispute still about whether or not, claim of Russia as a name, right? Whether it's actually as that legacy, sort of disputed between Russia and Ukraine to some degree, between the scholars, and it's understandable. But it became politicized, obviously. Mm-hmm. So, Ukrainians go through, and Ukrainian lands then go through a variety of different rulerships, right? There's, again, like all medieval Europe, there's no really state, right? If you look at Germany, for instance, right, we know that did not come into existence until 1871, or even modern Britain and its sort of borders and so on and so forth. So same story there. So there's the different princedoms, different empires that come and go, but there's also several attempts that we can trace through Ukrainian history when statehood was attempted. So if you remember, Grant, when we talked about the concept of sovereignty, and I tell you about the Treaty of Westphalia of 1648, well, it's also very important here for Ukraine, right? And it also tells you that incorporation of that greater European history, that same processes are happening there too, when there are attempts to create these Cossack states. They're called hetmanate, and hetman is like the military and political ruler of this of the Cossacks, right, which are the fighters of Ukraine, and they attempted to do that, and they fought with the Poland, and then they fought with Russia, and then it all gets really complicated. And basically, that project doesn't live too far, and basically Cossacks then as a state and their statehood hetmanates had been eradicated by another lovely person who you know as Catherine, Queen Catherine of Russia, Empress, also the Great. And she basically is the end of Ukrainian statehood when whatever is on territory of Ukraine gets subsumed, at least on the left bank of Dnieper, gets subsumed by the Russian Empire. And the attempts then to rebuild Ukrainian statehood occur at the beginning of the 20th century, which again, nothing new. This happened in Poland that regained its independence at the same time. This is happening in the Baltic states, and Ukrainians also have attempts to create their own republic. They make it a republic. They elect their own first president, and they sort of on that direction. And then, of course, in the civil war that follows Russian Revolution, they lose that fight for independence. And one of the bloodiest battles for Ukraine's independence was actually under Kyiv, in a place called Kruty, which now has this very, how do I want to say, the memorable place, right, for Ukrainian history and so on and so forth. And then when we talk about 1991, really it's the moment of regaining of independence, right? That finally this long tortured history that Ukrainian people have attempted to make a state of their own. And it's not just about, statehood for statehood purposes. It's not just Ukrainian stubbornness, right? But it also came with, there's Russian imperial occupation and then Soviet occupation came with serious practices of eradication of everything Ukrainian. Right? Whether it was forbidding Ukrainian language, forbidding publishing in Ukrainian, eradication of Ukrainian intelligentsia, right down genocide, that is the Holodomor of 1933. And there are several waves, right? Sort of, if you look at Ukrainian history, actually, had this conversation not long ago with some of my family members, that every single generation of Ukrainians for the last 200 years had its own moment of fighting the empire in one way, shape, or form. And right, that history is not written, right, because again, Russia as empire has this ability also to create knowledge, right, because that's the story that's being told, which means that the story of resistance to empire gets swept under the carpet and you don't hear that. So it's not common knowledge. And what you then get is, narrative from Moscow that says, well, we're actually the same people. Why? Because for 200 years we lived under this one great big state called the Russian Empire, and now they are just being stubborn, right? And Ukrainians have the lived memory of what actually it meant for every generation of killed, when my mother tells me story of my great-grandfather, her grandfather, who witnessed his cousins being executed by the Soviets in front of him, right? And there was this huge terror campaign of dispossession, sending people to gulags, arrests and murders and so on and so forth. So people remember that. So this moment of regaining independence in 1991 has a lot to do with reestablishing then that Ukrainianness and as a project of self-determination that finally Ukrainians received after so many years. So this is a long story of history, but there you are.
And that's the thing that we wanted to accomplish here is that it doesn't fit in a TikTok. Like, it's not a 30-second clip that can explain this very complex nature. And something that I always go back to, it's a book. This is not my original title, but 1991, there's a book. It's called When the World Seemed New. And that's kind of where the fall of the Soviet Empire, the fall of communism as we know it. And then, of course, America took the victory lap, right? And then, in my opinion, I think the 90s, we did some good things and some bad things, right?
Why did America take the victory lap?
Why did we?
Why did we?
Well, because we won the Cold War, baby.
So it's a deserved victory lap. Question mark?
the thing is, and it's not,
It is
Dr.
a question
Lena,
mark,
it's a
right?
question mark.
Because on the one hand, I remember this vividly when I first sort of arrived in the United States and I started studying political science and I started, went to graduate school. So my higher education is totally product of American liberal education, as it were, for all it's worth. But as I looked at all of these stories, it was a great deal of incongruence for me as well, right? My lived experience stories, what I heard, again, as a product of Soviet education system and then post-Soviet education system. And there's a lot of new narratives that I was experiencing. And one of them sort of was that Reagan's claim of owning the victory, right, of the Soviet Union, which, again, to his credit, Bush Sr. did not, right? He was much, much, much more careful. But many scholars, or at least many ideologues in the United States, attributed the collapse of Soviet Union to Reagan's politics. Yeah, sure, there's a lot to be said between how Reagan managed and worked with Gorbachev, who was a premier of Soviet Union at the time. But at the same time, USSR almost imploded domestically from the lack of economic growth, from horrific stagnation that it had experienced, and also the war in Afghanistan didn't help. Right, it was also the sort of the nail in the coffin of that particular empire, which kind of many of us hoping that this is going to be another nail in that. Never mind.
Well, Grant was just talking about this.
Yeah. Between the Ukrainian war right now and Russian entanglement there and Afghanistan in 1980s as well.
Which, Dr. Lena, forgive me for asking because I don't know. Is it true that the USSR the military that they sent to Afghanistan was primarily Ukrainians and other minorities in the USSR, or is that incorrect?
Well, again, yes and no, because you sort of have to look at sort of the imperial composition of Russian Empire period, because Russian Empire has done this for many, many centuries when they conquer people. And then they send the conquered minorities or conquered peoples, even if they're not necessarily minorities, right, to fight their wars. So, if you looked at the composition of Russian military at the beginning of invasion of Ukraine in 2022, full-scale invasion, we also noticed quite a bit of Siberian peoples represented there, of course, Chechens, who themselves suffered 2 wars since the collapse of Soviet Union. The first war in early 90s and then second war that was actually brought Putin to power, right? Also with some very disputed moments of how he handled it, but absolutely bloody, terrible affair that solidified now this despotic, horrific regime in Chechnya, in the Chechen Republic, that is part of the Russian Federation. And yes, that's uses the manpower and the resources of the colonized people against them. So yeah, it wouldn't surprise me to hear that kind of story. Yeah, there were quite a bit of people because Afghanistan was my childhood, and a lot of I shouldn't say a lot, but I among my father's acquaintances, friends, I knew men who fought in Afghanistan. Yeah,
and that's kind of where we wanted to go from, where we have a war now that's been raging. I say it started in 2014. I know there's
correct,
2 invasions.
Correct, yes.
Some people, again, they're like, 3 years. I'm like, the Ukrainian people have been fighting for more than a decade at this point. And I remember when, in 2014, when the little green men crossed the border, and I didn't necessarily understand what was going on, but at that moment, I was like, that doesn't sound right. And I was disappointed at the time that there wasn't more condemnation.
Right.
And that was me when I was 16. So
right.
I wasn't as fully developed as I am now with my own opinions. We kind of wanted to jump into that because I know that we talked about in your class the Maidan. Is it Maidan? Maidan revolution in 2014. And is it correct to say that moment kind of triggered because that removed kind of the Russian, not supported, but sympathetic, Ukrainian
I
president.
would go further than that. It's not just supported or sympathetic. It was a total puppet, of Kremlin. And Maidan of 2014, right? And Maidan, so your listeners know, right? It's actually a reference to a square. Maidan means square. So why it's called Maidan is because several, actually, not just that one, protest activities and revolutions happen on main square in Kyiv, which during the Soviet days used to be called, if memory serves me right, Maidan Перемоги, which is like victory square, but after the independence it became known as Independence Square, right?
Okay.
So it has been sort of very symbolic moment of Kyiv history. And I should also mention that that particular site and the anti-government and anti-Russian or anti-Soviet protests there were happening for a very long time. So there's at least two other revolutions that I can point out. One called the Revolution what the heck is an English word for it? Revolution na граниті, it sounds in Ukrainian, like on the pavement, right? Like revolution on the pavement, and then I think that's actually the proper
In
title.
the streets?
Yeah, right, in the streets, yeah. And there was the Orange Revolution in 2004, which actually was attempting to reestablish Ukraine's political independence. So 2013, 2014, right, you're right, it is a turning point for modern Ukrainian society, because you can sort of look into this moment from 1991 when Ukraine gets its independence, and by the way, it was discouraged by American government.
Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me.
Right, and there was actually a moment when George Bush, actually, senior, went to Ukrainian parliament, and he delivered the speech which Ukrainians have since dubbed the Chicken Kyiv speech, in which he attempted to sort of tell Ukrainian parliament that, independence for independence sake is not really freedom, right? So he tried to talk him out of declaring independence from the Soviet Union, because there was a fear, right, that if Soviet Union falls apart, it could lead to civil war. Rightly so, because Yugoslavia was a perfect example of that already brewing. And, many folks have been predicting that Soviet Union is going to implode. So the fact that we are going through this war now, and the fact that there are so many other sort of frozen military conflicts like Moldova, like Georgia, like the dispute between Armenia and Azerbaijan, which I hope they've settled now. But all of those are legacies of the Soviet Union, right? They took 30 years perhaps to really explode, and they've been sort of in this frozen and hot and cold stage over the years. But yeah, Ukraine and Russia, this particular moment, yeah, it is the aftermath of that. Maybe last throes of the imperial ambitions, which I hope they are, but nonetheless, right, there's a good explanations why they're there. So 2014, right, is really a moment when Ukrainians had this very important choice when they wanted to pursue European integration, because that after collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Czechia, Slovakia, they all expressed interest in joining European Union. Baltic states as well wanted to join European Union, and with that membership for them, and they went through serious negotiation processes, and many of them, except Romania and Bulgaria, who joined later, in 2004 was this big wave of ascension to the European Union, but also joining NATO. And Ukrainian society felt pretty ambivalent about NATO, to be honest with you. I would even argue, if you look at the statistics on that, because I know many people are blaming NATO for all of this, which is not the whole thing we can get into.
Yeah.
But if you really look at the sort of the public opinions about Ukraine joining Ukraine, it was relatively low, like under 30% all the way up until 2013 and so on. People really wanted to join European Union because that meant economic prosperity. That meant opportunities, that meant economic growth, that meant investment. And it also meant that European Union, because it has those prerequisites, commitment to democratic values. And that's a huge thing that I think very frequently we don't, it gets underplayed, that of all, I shouldn't say of all, but of all post-Soviet republics, despite the, maybe not counting the Baltic states, Ukrainians have the most robust democracy right? So compared to Belarus, compared to Russia, and what is more, right, that Ukrainians again have time and again defended that democracy. In 2004, when there was an attempt to sort of institute a puppet regime that would be more close to Russia, but also authoritarian, because to be a puppet regime to Russia, you have to be authoritarian. You can't be democratic regime and a puppet to Russia. Right, authoritarian regimes are very good for Russia to manipulate because they have not only the same value system, but it's also very easily corruptible, right? And democracy requires the transparency, and that's what Ukrainians sort of attempted to do. Yeah, very problematic, also with issues of corruption. But again, because there's this give and take constantly of Russia attempting to create those authoritarian shoestrings or pull strings to have those sort of puppet politicians or puppet oligarchs in Ukraine who would be steering Ukraine into corrupt authoritarian territory and ipso facto then into Russia's sphere of influence and tying it completely there. So Ukrainians defended it time and again, and 2013 really was sort of this big breaking point because the president at the time, who, by the way, Ukrainians did call out in 2004 for fraudulent elections, he then goes and with Russian help and support gets himself an American political advisor, Paul Manafort. You've heard about him, yeah. So Paul Manafort makes him this lovely new image, makes him look more like a Western type politician, but they also did a lot of damage then to also Ukrainian society, and that's a thing, right? When Russia wants to influence domestic politics, they have mechanisms that they can do it. And guess what? They practice on Ukraine to do this. So now when they know how to conduct that kind of hybrid warfare on the minds and hearts of people because they tested those tools already. So 2013, there's supposed to be a signing of association agreement with the European Union. On the eve of, the president, who was the president at the time, goes on television and says, "Dear Ukrainians, I've changed my mind." And what is more, right, that came as a huge surprise because everything was laid down. The meeting was happening. Like some of the accounts of people who were actually there for the signing, they were like, we were taken by surprise. And right, there was a lot of speculation at the time why that came into existence and why that came to fore. And there's been some accounts that I've heard from first-hand witnesses who said that Yanukovych received a personal phone call from Putin. Right, so it wasn't just like a threat, probably to Ukraine or Ukraine's economy, because Russia has done this type of thing when they shut off gas in the middle of the winter. But also, I think from we can gather this was a personal threat to Yanukovych as well, and that's what led people to take to the streets. Now, to overthrow the regime, that was not the goal when all of that started, right? And started as, like a demand for the government to change the mind, because it was an electoral promise, and that's what people voted for. That's what people expected. It was a betrayal. But the government, instead of addressing protesters heads on, what they do, they send out police, and police do not particularly nicely treat the protesters. And what is more, that protesters at the time are college students. And, when people see their kids bloodied up, they react. And that was particularly nasty and particularly bloody, and the police brutality just went off the roof. So basically, it's another story about sort of people finding refuge in old places of worship, right? There's a monastery that is just up the hill from Maidan and St. Michael's Cathedral, where the monks basically opened the gate and sheltered the youth. And then that was actually also the first time that since 13th century that the bells rang on the St. Michael's Cathedral to warn people about sort of that there was assault on the city by the police. So that then triggers the Maidan revolution, which Ukrainians call the revolution of dignity. And I've argued it before elsewhere, and in my upcoming manuscript, my upcoming book, I call it this revolution, like decolonization catharsis, right? That this is a moment of nation that was born or reborn in 91, but now in 2013, these are people your age, right, right in 20s, who grew up now in this independent Ukraine, who don't have all that luggage, all that Soviet imperial stuff, and who now saying, this is our country, this is how we want it to run, this is how we want it, and we are going to defend it. And that's what that revolution really was all about. And if you look now at the people who are now at the front lines, again, these are people your age out there, right? These are people in their 20s, which makes another tragedy of it all, because this war, not only Russians are stealing children, right? Basically the future of Ukraine, but they are actually killing Ukraine's youth. Again, the future of the nation, the future of the country. So you're absolutely right. It is a turning point for Ukrainian society that, on so many levels, again, is commitment to democracy, but also this younger generation that I'm not going to take it.
And I think that my perspective on all of this is, and this is like my global perspective on it, where of course I believe America is a great country, all that jazz, but we kind of, after that, the fall of the Soviet Union, we decided that all the threats in the world were gone, and the people who were living under those regimes, for the most part, we just ignored, and we did not continue to help them. Case in point is Afghanistan, where after the Soviets left, the country fell to the Taliban. Yugoslavia, we did help with the NATO bombings and all that, if you are supportive of the bombings. But going into this modern time, we've been so preoccupied as a country with other topics that I think the United States has gotten a little soft when it comes to foreign entanglements, and seeing that reaction starting in 2014 all the way to now of the conflict that's been brewing and been fighting. Why did Russia, after they occupied Crimea, why did they move to a full-scale invasion in your viewpoint? Because I know that there's a lot of punditry about it, but kind of from your viewpoint and on the ground, what do you think you see?
So there's a couple of things that I want to address before I jump into your question.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, right, think about it this way. United States did not necessarily become soft. United States had a different perspective now about what the world is going to look like, because you gotta remember, I'll tell you guys, in the 1990s, I feel like an old lady, in the 1990s, there's a lot of conversations about sort of what the future of NATO even should be.
Yeah.
Right? Whether or not NATO even was necessary, whether or not there was need for revamping of the, many of the institutions of the global governance, as it were, and what was going to be the role of the United States in all of this. But the turning point for United States really was 9/11, and we cannot undersell that or understate that, because on one hand, right, George Bush said the second, right, and George W. Bush, right, he came as a really isolationist too, right? In his conservative mind, he really was not looking for any kind of entanglements, right? If anything,
he was anti-bombing.
Yeah. He was very
Yugoslavia.
Correct. Yeah. So he was very much on that isolationist side, which is the line of the conservative even today. But what changed him was 9/11, right? And then, of course, with 9/11, the first time when Article 5, that is one for all and all for one of NATO, gets invoked in history of that organization. And the United States now has entangled itself in other wars. And I think that currently now, even if you fast forward to 2014, United States population, again, ran out of appetite for foreign wars.
Yes.
Right, and Afghanistan and then Iraq really have contributed to that. The long entanglement in Afghanistan, which one mistake after the other. Iraq, huge mistake after another, for so many reasons. But yeah, so by the time, it is not surprising that you have this wave of very much isolationist revival, as it were, and perhaps feeling of being betrayed by some of the conservative leadership, right, on behalf of the conservative Americans, and
And the
rightly
thing,
or wrongly.
that's kind of where I always have found an issue. Not to get too in the weeds on American politics, because I don't want to muddy the waters with this, because I want this to be a bipartisan issue. But the conservatives are the ones who sent us to war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And then now they're the ones who are saying, when I'm not saying I necessarily want American troops or NATO to get involved in Ukraine. I actually would probably think that that's a smarter option. That's my view. But now we have a whole population where they're like, we're tired of these wars. But
and who can't read between the lines of the differences in each
differences
region,
between the regions and the wars, and the fighting that took place in Afghanistan and Iraq compared to, and I'm not glorifying this, and Kyle knows this, I'm always talking about, but the footage I've seen from the front lines of the Ukraine conflict is like night and day. It's not even the same type of fighting. It's like, I don't think America is even capable of understanding what the Ukrainian military is putting up with. Again, when it comes to the Russian assaults and the FPV drones, the horrific human wave assaults from the North Koreans, things like that. I don't think we and I think that's really bad.
So we absolutely can talk about American approach to Ukraine, because I think it's very important sort of how the war is perceived, and the fact that, as we pointed out, many folks believe that it's already over, that conflict is resolved, and for many, yes, it would be great if it did disappear from the news altogether, and then everybody can take a victory lap and say, okay, it's over. But it isn't. But I wanted to go back to sort of your question about 2014 and the first wave of Russian invasion. The fact is that, again, when Russia first moved in on Crimea in 2014, in the spring of 2014, that was just such a moment that took everybody by surprise. And it did nothing really for Ukrainian army that wasn't ready for that either. So Ukrainians basically did make a conscious decision. And I'm going to be very careful here, because there were people killed over that. So when you hear in things like this that Crimea was given up without a single shot fired, it's not true. It's absolutely untrue. There's plenty of death there. There's plenty of fighting. People attempted to defend that. But, Russian forces basically forced Ukrainian military and Ukrainian folks out of Crimea, on foot sometimes, right, across into the mainland of Ukraine, and basically took it over through this coup. Putin never actually wanted to recognize Ukraine's independence or its possession of Crimea, and that's sort of the big dispute story there. And again, according to some accounts, there's been attempts by Putin to move in on occupation of Crimea even as early 2000s.
And why is it important for him to have that section?
It's important, actually. For the same reason why the aforementioned Catherine, right, fought the war to take it away from, to conquer it from Turks, right, when they had that, when they conquered Crimea. Because it's a warm water port, absolutely, right, and it's very important for Russian Empire that is landlocked, right, and what has made Russia a different kind of empire from all the rest of them, right, that they could not expand across the water, right, so they had to expand across the land. Hence, you have this gigantic Russia of 12 time zones and never-ending horizons of undeveloped wilderness. So it's strategically quite important for those reasons, because Russia can then wield geopolitical ambitions through having access and control in the Black Sea, which, again, it enjoyed during the times of USSR, right? It had Crimea, it had access to Bulgaria, right? So it could then put up with and challenge Turkey on its dominance over the Bosphorus Strait, right, that connects the Black Sea to the Mediterranean Sea.
And geopolitics are kind of confusing for people. As far as I'm aware, Turkey and Russia, because Turkey has some weird alliances that I'm not a big fan of, but Turkey and Russia do not like each other. Is that correct?
Well,
I don't know.
yeah, it's kind of hard to speak about like and not like in geopolitical
Yeah,
terms
my
between
bad.
countries always, because there's strategic interest for Turkey to be on speaking terms with Russia, attempt to recognize certain concerns, and to be able to be in a position where they can, and they have over the last what now 11 years of the war between Russia and Ukraine, to be the facilitator in some ways of the communication between Russia and Ukraine. So, like the meetings in May, right, that were happening in Istanbul and Antalya and so on and so forth, and in Turkey, right, they hosted them. And in 2022, there was some attempts to resolve the war at the beginning, also fostered in Turkey and Istanbul. So Turkey has its own interest in there because obviously they do not want to have a occupied Ukraine.
Hmm.
They probably do not want Russia to have that control. They would have liked Crimea back in Ukrainian hands rather than Russian hands. But at the same time, they don't want to have too much conflict with Russia either. They have enough on their hands because
Yep.
there's Armenia and Azerbaijan to consider also, that
Hmm.
they have various stakes, Russia and Turkey. And so, yeah, that's a long answer to your short question.
No, that's great. This is what we're wanting, so
But
this is great.
but
Yeah.
because of that, Turkey actually is in a great position to be then that facilitator,
Yeah.
right? That can be, trusted not to take sides, as it were, and it has done so far.
And I want to move forward to the 2022 and present, and this might, I, it's, I want to highlight the resilience of the Ukrainian people as well as the Ukrainian defenders on the front lines, because we see a lot of statistics, we see a lot of videos, we see a lot of people talking about it, but I this is my view. I've seen it. The British Armed Forces were training some Ukrainian soldiers in trench warfare. There's a video on YouTube about it. It's a recent video. And one of the things that stuck out to me was, and it makes me emotional because this really bothers me. I know I don't have much personal connection to it, but it does affect my future, our future, your future, everything like that. The soldiers who are being interviewed, their faces are covered because of obvious reasons, but they are, one of the guys was like, I was a taxi driver. I was I think there was a university professor.
Yep.
It's people from, and I'm not putting down modern militaries, but it's people you don't necessarily see in the modern military. So it's affecting every facet of life. There was one who said, I'm a tax accountant, and he's carrying an M4, and he's clearing trenches with the guys. It's affecting everyday life of everyday people. It's not something that's far away. And some of the statistics that we've seen, and I don't know how accurate they are, but the Ukrainians are putting up a hell of a fight against the Russian attackers. And I've seen that there's been 1 million casualties on the Russian side. I've seen that the North Koreans are getting routed by the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians invaded into Kursk, which is a historic from World War II. So people are like, oh, but what is it like? Because you have friends, you have family who are involved in there. What is Ukraine at war like right now for the people who are living there? This is something that I don't think anyone who's alive in the United States, besides a very small percentage of World War II veterans, know what a country is like at war.
Unified, it sounds
unified.
like.
Yeah.
And I also want to get into some opposition because I know that we talked about that. I also want to go into the opposition, but after that.
Yeah, so on one hand, this is a really, really interesting question you're asking me. This is not like any war that's been fought yet, for a couple of reasons. One, this is not the war that just happens on the front lines, right? So the front is huge, geographically vast. But also, Ukrainian cities are bombed on a daily basis. Right? So your civilian population that supposedly is safe because they are not been invaded or occupied, they're not safe. And as a matter of fact, they're not safe from anything because you have drones, you have missiles, you have other such things that are flying over Ukraine's territory and doing tremendous amount of damage on a daily basis. So in that sense, the entire entirety of the country is involved in the war, right? On one hand, basically, I don't think there is a family in Ukraine who is not affected, who doesn't have someone they know or a family member who is on the front lines. And you're absolutely right. And that's also important to understand, right? That when we hear statements like, well, Ukrainians choose to go to war with Russia. Well, did they choose to go to war with Russia? Did they choose to not give up and
Right.
and be completely occupied and wiped off the face of the earth? And it's really a choice,
Right.
Is it really a choice? Because yeah, you're right. The taxi drivers, IT people, lawyers, whoever, right? The folks in the front lines, they're poets, children books writers. They not necessarily military people until now, so everybody's involved. But also in the cities and bigger cities and smaller cities all over Ukraine, right? You also have people who are holding the the back home life, and they have to contribute to economy, and they go to work, but they go do that after sleepless nights,
Right.
because what Russians do, they unleash the holy hell on Ukrainian cities in the middle of the night. So they start in the evening and they go on till 5-6 o'clock in the morning. So you have these sleepless nights of folks either trying to hide in at home in the bomb shelters, or they trying to you know they have this two-wall rule, right? That in any apartment building, you need to find a room that has at least two walls between you and the outside. So usually it's a bathroom. So that's why you see so many pictures on like TikTok or anywhere else, right, from kids sleeping in bathtubs, because the rule of two walls, and usually the bathtubs are not acrylic like United States we have here, but like old-fashioned metal, cast iron stuff that it actually protects, should protect people. And then they get up and they go to work, right, every day. And we need to also make a point of it that those attacks have increased exponentially in the last 6 months.
And why?
Which you don't hear about.
Which you don't hear about, and that's something that I'm very frustrated about, because I follow all the Ukrainian media that I need to understand as far as I can. What has changed? I know what's changed, but what has changed in the last 6 months in the United States with the United States, with Ukraine, with Russia? What has changed in the last 6 months where we have seen a dramatic increase? Because I don't say it in any way, but I know that I've seen statistics that the front line, Russia is making some inroads. Is that right? They've kicked the Ukrainians out of Kursk, or there was a strategic retreat or something with that.
Yeah. So well, change in administration. That's what happened. Change in administration and change in policy, and it's significant because the mistakes have been made by all administrations across the board. Going back to your question of 2014, Obama administration really dropped the ball on that one as well, right? In terms of lackluster reaction to Russian occupation, and then when Russians did move into sort of being a provocateur, because remember they never declared war. Even now there hasn't been a declaration of war.
The special military operation.
It's a special military operation. It's done for purposes, right? Because it's sort of testing the limits of international law and the pushing the envelope on the fear of Western leadership, or leadership not in the Western world, but any leader of any country, right, around the world, in terms of how much they are willing to push back against Russia's aspirations here. And to be fair, like, I expected the full-scale invasion in 2015, and it did not happen, right? Instead, we had this more or less frozen conflict I shouldn't say it's frozen conflict, because it continued on since 2014 on all the way to 2022. And Russians also claimed that they didn't participate, that they painted it a civil war. And many of us believed it at the time, right? Without lack of information or something like that. Because, right,
The little green men, right?
Just the green men, but like in Lugansk and Donetsk, right?
Oh,
That
that's
there
right.
were in the east of Ukraine, there were we knew that there were people who were supportive of Russian occupation, who wanted to be part of Russia. But again, there were people who did not want that, and they continued to have that pushback. But the difference between Crimea and Lugansk and Donetsk was that Ukrainian government that was able to reform after the Maidan revolution and after the president that was deposed by that revolution. By the way, it wasn't deposed; he ran away. Basically,
Did he flee to Russia?
Yeah, he ran away. Yeah, he ran away in the middle of the night, and nobody knew where he was. And then basically he left the country, just to figure out what they were going to do, and the parliament stepped in, and then they moved on. So that new government that was formed after that decided to recognize it and call Russia out on its actions, and then engage them militarily. And so that process went on. But then, if you look back at like 2022, fast forward to 2022, there were mistakes made there as well in terms of how fast the sanctions were being introduced, how much actual military support Ukraine did receive and did not receive, and in what volumes it received it. Because time and again, and I think it's important for us here in this country to remember, nobody has asked for American troops on the ground in Ukraine. And one thing that sort of bothers me to this day, and I still, for the life of me, again, as someone who studies international relations and things of that nature, I still can't find an answer. Why is it that NATO could not participate in helping Ukraine to deal with drone attacks on Ukraine on a daily basis? Because, right, I can understand the fact that you can't close the sky like in the beginning of the war when you actually had artillery being delivered by airplanes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you have a manned vehicle. Yes, you have a Russian military person. So if NATO fires upon them, that is indeed a confrontation with Russia. But, this whole Polish example of this week brought this back to my attention, right? That, right, the Russian drones fly into Polish territory. NATO takes them down. Article 4, they in consultations, lovely. But Russian reaction is not like, oh, that's it, we're in war now with NATO because they took down unmanned vehicles. Because they unmanned vehicles, for Christ's sake, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's just a piece of equipment. So I don't see any really logical reason, and maybe I'm just not looking properly, but what is the logical reason that those same NATO forces couldn't help Ukrainians cover, let's say, part of Ukrainian sky from those very drones? Nobody's asking for people on the ground. Nobody's asking for any of that. And that way, again, you're saving a ton of money also that could be in the, and for Ukrainians to also be more protective of their bigger cities or other places or other strategic places where they can, save lives, save infrastructure, and so on.
And that's, I don't know where Kyle's at on that. I mean, I thought initially I said, let's put a no-fly zone on this. Let's give them whatever they need. Like, that was originally my position on that, and then continuing, I totally agree with that. That's what should be happening right now with the unmanned vehicles, because that's what's that's kind of what the war is increasingly turned to. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and that's what makes this war so different from the rest of them. That and why is it becoming the drone warfare? Why? Because Ukrainians are lacking resources.
Yeah,
we know that. And nobody claimed that from the beginning, right? If you look back at 2022, in February, people expected it all to be over in 3 days.
Right.
So 3 years on, right, the Ukrainians have proven that they can be not only resilient, not only unified, not only this, and the other thing, which is another whole problem, because I also think it dehumanized Ukrainians, making them some kind of super war heroes that can hold off Russia forever.
Right.
It's not going to be the case, and people do get tired, and this is why that air campaigns have so increased.
Right.
Because one of their ways to pressure population into submission is by terrorizing them night and day, to show to them that, right, that nobody's supporting you now. You're on your own. There is, the faster you accept your fate, the better. Listen, I've heard those arguments in 2022.
Yeah.
As in, like, why nobody should support Ukraine or give Ukrainians opportunity to defend themselves, because it's only going to prolong their suffering and create more victims, which is all kinds of problematic in my book for the argument, and now as well. But the Russians have intensified it again, because now they have they have an opportunity to do so as sort of under the auspices of continued peace talks.
Well, and I want to get into the peace talks. I do want to say one thing. I'm guilty of this. At the original invasion point in February 22, there was a video. It was Zelensky and his crew in the middle of Kyiv, and they put the gangster music on it, and he's like, "We're not leaving. We're here." That was like very like gung ho at the time. I was like, "This is awesome," but I totally agree with you, and we're firmly on the center left. So of course in America everything is political, but we see. I see a lot of people, they're like, Ukraine. I'm like, do you support like sending them more stuff or fly zone? I'm like, oh, no, but they can. I'm like, no, guys, this is like a real war. Like, I don't think you understand what you're talking about.
Which is a major perception problem in this country, I think.
Yeah.
And with the money and the equipment that we're sending over, you were even talking before we walked in here about what purposes that equipment was supposed to be used for.
Yeah.
Right. They were
What
sanctioning
those taxes-
what you could use it for.
Yes.
And that was the thing that always drove me insane. But it wasn't like, again, this is a top issue for me, but it wasn't like when we were having our election in the United States, it wasn't like both candidates were like, well, let's talk about this, and I want to give Ukrainians the missiles that can go into Russian territory. Like, no one talked like that. So
Right.
It wasn't a top issue to most people. But I think we had a pro-Ukrainian president and Biden. I think Trump, and I think he had some flaws there. And then Trump is whatever the wind is flowing, and he's going to invite Putin to Alaska, which I know it might be propaganda, but it's true. Russian Federation forces have patches that have the outline of Russia, and it includes Alaska on it. So like these people Russia is not our friend, and I'm alarmed by the amount of Americans who think that this country that has terrorized. I mean, I've seen the footage, and Kyle knows I watch this stuff, which I shouldn't. But if there's war, I watch the footage to see what's going on. What the Russians are doing is just barbaric. And I wanted to kind of turn that into kind of with our modern day, like 2025. President Trump invited Putin to Alaska to have a peace talk without the Ukrainians present. I know that there's professional negotiators. Is that correct? That are negotiating in a third-party location?
Well, that's the protocol under normal circumstances. Yeah, that there always has to be sort of big decisions are not made entirely at the summits, right? That summits usually are the places where decisions are finalized.
Right.
And that's also been sort of Putin's story as well, that he wants negotiators to negotiate. But we can talk about the negotiators too, because I am convinced that the reason why all President Trump's efforts of ending this particular war are in Moscow.
Yeah.
Putin has zero desire to end this war. He sees himself as winning this war. Now that he has the United States, that again, you asked me about Kursk. The story is that was precisely the time when United States stopped supply of Ukrainian weapons, but most importantly stopped sharing intelligence with Ukraine, and that's what basically was one of the reasons that forced Ukrainians out of Russian territory, which again could have been a bargaining chip in negotiation process. So there's a lot of strange things that going on with approach to solving the war here and bringing peace to Ukraine from this administration.
And how is it viewed? And I don't know how things work in Ukraine or in the Baltics or anything like that, but how is it viewed? It's like we're overblown with all of our political BS. I don't know if it's the same there, like with the algorithms. How is it viewed in Ukraine when they see the red carpet rolled out for Putin?
Well, I can tell you my perspective as an American, and I'm watching this.
Yeah. I was livid by the way.
It's sickening. It's sickening to see the red carpet being rolled out on American soil for the murdering dictator who struts down the line and being welcomed by the President of the United States. You and I can have a whole other conversation why there are voices on American right of political spectrum who claim that Russia is not their enemy, because again, they found a common enemy in the wokeness, as it were, right? And Russia very happy to exploit that. And Russia under Putin has gone through the process of desecularization, right? Where you can think about, like, a time where I was growing up, atheism was a state policy.
That's right.
Now, 30 years later, Russia become a place where there is a law that punishes people for offending the feelings of the believers, right? So it's like 180 in 30 years. So, there's the good reason why sort of folks who are more conservative, who are more in traditional values, who understand and sort of value different values on church and state, they can try to find connections there with or see themselves on a same moral footing perhaps than domestic policies as defenders of traditional values in Russia. Now, all of that is, of course, could be highly suspect. Like I said, you and I can have another whole podcast on that whole story.
Yeah.
It's fascinating to me as well.
Which you put that very, very diplomatically, but I see like siren, like red lights flashing when I hear that, because that's a topic of discussion domestically here of like how that separation of church and state is eroding largely, and that's very anti-American and who we are as a country. It sounds like that was not always the case over there either.
No.
And it can change very quickly.
That's a fascinating place, and again, like who there, where, and how.
One thing that I don't know if you knew this, but I don't know if I mentioned it in our class, and it's been a long time, but since I was in your class, but we've been to Russia. I don't know if you know that.
No, I didn't know that.
We've been to St. Petersburg.
Oh, St. Petersburg. I think your father told me that story.
Yeah, which like
2 days, yeah.
But like when we went there, I was like, I wasn't aware, but like I knew there was something off. I was like, there's something wrong here. And then they were talking about the churches, how they used to be ice skating rinks, and things like that.
Yeah.
And I was like, so I know that's not. I'm not saying like I've been to Russia. I know what I'm talking about, but like we've been to this country that is
so like
horrible.
Actually, it's an interesting story, right? So the site of like the Church of the Christ the Savior that's next to Kremlin. This is where the infamous Pussy Riot did their staging, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So that church was rebuilt after the collapse of USSR because Soviets blew it up and made it a gigantic publicly available pool that was there functioning all 4 seasons around.
That's funny.
Yeah, so in the middle of winter, it was heated pool and people can go there and like do diving and exercises and stuff like that in the middle of Moscow where the church used to be. And now it's church again, and it's,
I will say 2 things. I know I'm kind of going in the weeds here before I want to wrap it up because I don't want to keep you all day, but this has been so awesome. The 2 things I want to mention is the big statue in Kyiv with the shield and the crest of Ukraine. What is that called?
Oh, yeah, the motherland.
The motherland. So that was a former Soviet statue, right?
So there's actually 2 motherlands. One in Kyiv, and you see her there with a shield and a sword, and she stands. Actually, it's quite a holy place for Ukrainians as well. She stands on top of the museum for the World War II that commemorates, and she's sort of I don't recall which way she faces. It's been a while, but yeah, she used to have on her shield. She used to have a crest of Soviet Union. Now it's Ukrainian crest. Another one is in.
Is it Stalingrad?
Yeah, in Stalingrad. Well, Stalingrad. It used to be Stalingrad. Its actual name is, and now of course I can't think of it. I can't believe that it just happened to me. That it totally just. Of course, I will think of it the moment we stop recording. And it's pretty terrifying motherland there.
It's a big one.
Yeah, it's humongous as well.
Those are the 2 images when I think of things. I think I know this is going to be very corny, but I think of the Ukrainian motherland statue fighting that one. And that's
Russian propaganda actually had a really interesting image, but no, their motherland was not fighting Ukrainian one. She was fighting Statue of Liberty, beheading the Statue of Liberty.
Well, yeah, I mean, and that's the thing where I kind of want to wrap this up where what's something that you wish that Americans, all political spectrums, knew about this and would pay more attention to? Because I know that Kyle and I, we avoid talking about Israel and Hamas just because it's so charged. But that's taken over. Everyone loves talking about it. it's distraught and destroyed. I think
We
that's
have
one thing.
talked about it,
We
but
have talked,
we
but
haven't
it's not
done like a
enough.
dedicated.
I don't want to do a dedicated because
I want to, but I want to connect your question to like what in your view, how can we get people to care about this? Like where's the disconnect and how does that disconnect get mended?
And how can we counter the misinformation? Because we get a lot of
These are lots of questions. Sorry.
I'm sorry. Yeah. From your perspective, I should say.
Yeah. Well, yeah, misinformation. It's like a hydra, right? You take it down one head, 10 more spring up, and there are sort of narrative and talking points that are very distressing in terms of that Ukrainians should not have defended themselves, that Ukrainians should just give up, that occupation is not that terrifying. No, occupation is terrifying. Occupation is deadly. We know that because Ukrainians have lived occupation for many years, like under USSR. Ukrainians also have seen what occupation looks like more recently. And it's occupation is not just about land and territory. Because I think another horrible thing is that we think about it sometimes as like real estate deals. Dudes, this is not real estate deals.
Right.
We're talking about people's possessions. We're talking about people's lives. Children who go missing, women who get raped, men who get disappeared, right? I mean, it's not that, it's not bloodless real estate deal.
Well, it would be like asking Americans, which state would you want to give
Right,
away?
together with its population. And
Right.
if you don't like it, get out and leave all your possessions behind and start all over new. Who knows where?
Right.
So there are narratives that need to be flagged down time and time again. Another one that absolutely upsets me is the story about sort of Zelensky standing in a way of the peace. Well, no, Zelensky is not standing in the way of the peace. Zelensky attempting to find the best solution possible for his people because, believe me, nobody wants peace more than Ukrainians. Not the soldiers on the front lines. They are sick and tired of fighting. They want to know what they're fighting for. And with this particular, in the last 6 months, right, I see a lot of tiredness is one thing, but also kind of they questioning what are we fighting for if the world does not support us anymore.
Right.
If we feel betrayed by the same values that we thought we were protecting, like independence. Because I have to tell you, the Ukrainian population overall, it's not woke liberal folks either, right?
Yeah.
There's a ton of people there that supported Trump precisely because they also support conservative values.
Right.
And they thought that maybe, with this particular presidency, when he was talking about bringing peace, they thought, okay, cool, maybe we can totally have a negotiation. So there's a lot of disappointment on behalf of Ukrainians who sort of put their eggs into that basket and hoping that Trump's presidency would bring peace. And it's a problem to think about this. And again, and same goes for regular folks who do want peace. But again, how is it going to be achieved? And again, it's not really Zelensky's deal because he is a democratically elected president who is beholden to his people for the actions and choices that he makes. So in terms of how you fight narratives, I know it's a lot of work. It sometimes feels like, I can tell you from my own personal feelings, that sometimes I feel exhausted to tell the same story, to rebuff the same talking points time and time and time again. But it needs to be done. It needs to be remembered. And when you guys asking me what people should know and think about, and I don't think the arguments from just moral perspective and value perspective work any longer. And you have to think about, unfortunate, I think it's also human nature, because the longer the war continues, and we know that it's not just Ukraine, any war continues, then you sort of start to get this dehumanization moment, you start to get desensitized, because how much violence can you see on the screen, how much violence, especially if you have domestic violence as well, that is growing. So in some ways, those type of moral claims lose their punch. So I like to point out things like when you and I started with, when you asked me about the question about Afghanistan and composition of armies, that, if Ukraine falls, despite the huge devastation to eradication basically of Ukrainian nation from the territory that is now Ukraine, you're also looking at all of the technology, all of the resources, yes, human power, because what happens to Ukrainian children that Russia's taken away? They training them to be to fight for Russian Empire, right? For Russia. They send, and they're gonna be sending them like they send in Chechen, like they send in Yakuts, like they send in, you know, any one of their colonized peoples into Ukraine. They'll be coming further west. They'll be coming into Poland. They'll be coming wherever Russia decides to have the new front line. You know, all Ukraine's rich lands, all Ukraine's farming, all Ukraine's natural resources, nuclear power plants, access to water, etc., because again, remember, Ukraine and Russia also together supplied like over 30% of world grain. So that then becomes a monopoly of one country. And what is more, we sort of have to also consider this flawed narrative that also sort of ties to that is the relationship with China. That the idea that somehow United States can wrangle Russia away from China and make Russia our ally against China, that is a deeply flawed argument. It's a very flawed thinking. The more this war continues, the more Russia becomes subservient to China. It becomes dependent on China. And there's no way that you can use Russia against China in that kind of fashion. If anything, right, a sound defeat, dare I say, of Putin's regime would be a message to China about what we're willing to put up with and what we're not willing to put up with. Make an example of Russia. But I know that fear is the primary driving factor why nobody wants to engage with Russia, because, and I get this all the time, whenever I talk about Russia's defeat, everybody says, but how do you even imagine this? Because it's a nuclear power and, you know, it's going to use nuclear power, its nuclear attack on anybody. Well, that's the reality of things. We'll never know.
Right.
But to live in constant fear and appease a dictator and allow them to do so, what messages are we sending then around the world? We might as well just all climb into the
China train.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So think about those sort of economic reasons, military reasons, security reasons, those arguments. You know, there's good other reasons for supporting Ukraine if values no longer appeal.
Yeah. Wow.
Which is bleak, but true.
That's where it's at right now.
Yeah. Because if you think about this, also Ukrainians have now tested their army against this second largest army of the world, and they are. I mean, Ukraine is not a small country; it's the largest country in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
So it is a landmass, it is resources, it is also people, it is also now this very strong army with a technological know-how of this completely new warfare that also can work either against NATO or for the benefit of NATO, which means for the benefit of the United States or against the interest of the United States. So it's our choice, sort of, which way do we want to go? Give it up or really recognize that we already made so much investment in there that it would be really silly to walk away.
And would you say that the fear is what's holding? Obviously, there's other factors too, but for me, and I know I'm sounding very Rambo America, but I feel like if the power of NATO plus the battle-hardened Ukrainian military wanted to, we could sweep into Russia pretty quickly and defeat them militarily. I don't think they have the will. The will, yeah. I just don't.
Because nobody wants to imagine World War III, and everybody thinks that we can avoid.
Nobody wants to be seen as responsible for it either.
Nobody wants to take responsibility for that. Absolutely,
nobody. But there's a lot more Chamberlains than there are Winston Churchills. For in a British example.
Yeah.
I feel like there's a lot of Chamberlains.
Yeah, there are, and the longer this goes on, the longer Russia will also exploit that weakness, right? And because what are they doing with the populations as well, right? Not just with the leadership, but also with why all these right-wing parties are gaining momentum, or pro-Russian narratives are gaining momentum in Europe. Because again, they're able to tell them that, look, the longer this war goes on, the more you give up of your own weapons to Ukraine, right? The more you sort of destabilize the inevitable. You might as well just put an end to it and be done with that. And it's sort of a dangerous way of thinking. And yeah, I think it's fear. Yeah, it's fear. It's desire of non-confrontation and this very naive way of thinking. I always say that I don't want to be sounding like a conspiracy theorist or to be alarmist, because I don't want to be alarmist, and people have called me a warmonger already several times throughout my last 3 years. The point is that we are already in a very serious global conflict, whether we want to admit it or not. And the faster we admit to it, the faster we start thinking about it not as a regional issue, or worse yet, that it's some kind of fraternal rivalry, God forbid, right? Or children playing in the park, the sooner we recognize the larger scale and impact that this conflict already has, and start taking steps in that direction, the better it would be. And thinking about what might it look like about Russia's defeat, because again, nobody wanted the Soviet Union to collapse.
Yeah.
Because I'm also afraid. So, lesson from that should be learned, not that big empire shouldn't collapse, but that are you gonna be prepared when that happens? And what's your policy gonna look like when that happens? Yeah. And we don't want to think about it because we're afraid.
And that is dreary ending to our podcast. But I want to end this with a few thoughts, and I know Kyle might have some too. But I think that there's two things that I would recommend all listeners to do. This is something that I do on a daily basis. I call every day at noon. I call my congressman and ask him to fund Ukraine military response. I've also said let's go, and we need to defeat the Russian Federation. I do that every day at noon. If you call your U.S. representative, their district office, 9 times out of 10, someone's going to pick up. Call your U.S. representative, tell them to support Ukraine. Democrat, Republican, doesn't matter. The second one, and this one's a little more dark, but I know that we're going to talk about it next week. I think one of the reasons why the shooting of Charlie Kirk has been such a dominant news cycle this past week
is because people watched it happen.
Because they watched the footage of a man literally dying, and I'm not being graphic, but you literally watched him die on footage, and people saw it. I saw it. I would highly recommend people look up some war footage of Ukraine, because we should know what the people there are going through, and there's plenty of it available. I'm not saying that in a grotesque way, but look that up to see what the Ukrainians are doing to protect their homeland. And that could be, Eastern Europe 5 years from now if we're not doing something.
And not even 5 years.
I'm gonna call you Dr. Lena. To the point that you've made throughout, this is not something that I talk about, I think, regularly on this podcast. Is a lot of people here think that's happening over there. And what you just kind of sewed together, this is not an isolated incident that happens somewhere else. We are not immune to this. And I think that's what I think people, the answer to my own question is, how can we get people to care? This could easily be us.
Yeah, and that's not something that people want to hear, because precisely they, remember that this is exactly what the Oval Office fiasco was, right? Because you don't tell us what to do, because we want to not think about something bad happening to us, because we are impervious to those type of things. We're not impervious.
Not at all.
Well, and I would say one lesson from history is that we've been here before. In the United States, we've thought that our oceans would protect us. And we said it was a problem for Europe. We actually said it twice in the First and Second World War. And then we eventually had to get involved. And I think if we had gotten involved sooner, things, I think, might have not been as chaotic. So I just want to make sure that people are taking this seriously. And I wish that the politics could stop around it. What happened at the Oval Office a couple months ago was honestly, I don't get fired up about most things. I was just talking to Kyle about this. I've been on the ashwagandha grind, but
people laugh at what happened in the Oval Office, but it's not funny.
It's not funny whatsoever.
It has ramifications that echo across the world.
It's very rich to see these people who have no idea what's going on, or they do, or they're just ignoring it and belittling the leader of a country. And it's not like calling Zelensky a Superman. He's just there he's just there advocating for his people. And that's the thing that I could not believe how many people were just laughing about it.
Yeah.
And it's not funny.
Well, I thank you for the calls for congressmen. I think it's a great idea. One thing is that, yes, the footage is very available. And, my streamline and my social media every day is filled with dead or dying people. And on one hand, it's a horribly desensitizing thing, because I think a lot of problems in perception of Ukraine, perceptions of politics, because we turned into a reality TV show.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yep.
Yeah, and it's in the politics has gone into that direction as well. That, whatever it's worth, it made for good television. The
Yep.
Oval Office, like I said,
Yeah.
despite the implications that it might have.
Oh my gosh.
And I think that's how we leave it
I think we're
for
gonna
this.
leave it.
I'd love to have you back,
Yeah,
because
we would
this
love
is
to have you
very
back.
informative. Yeah.
Hopefully to talk about how Ukraine wins this war. And how they
Amen.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much
Thanks for
your
being
time.
here.
Appreciate it.